Welcome to the Planning for Life podcast with certified financial planner professional Russell Jacobs and financial life advisor Carl Coolidge. Carl and Russell will share creative strategies and ideas for overcoming challenges in your personal and financial life. Inevitably, life happens, and we will empower you to reach your destination. Thanks for joining us. Now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to another podcast with Russell Jacobs. Today we're going to talk about difficult conversations surrounding money. We're going to start talking about how to have a conversation with your parents about what's going on with money. Russell is very experienced with this, not just because he's been a financial advisor for so long, but he's also dealt with this personally. He's had friends who've dealt with this personally. And this is a really difficult thing for the sandwich generation to really have to deal with, is having those difficult conversations with their parents. So Russell, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Matt. Glad to be here.
All right. I'm just going to go ahead and ask you a wildly open-ended question here. Where do you even begin, and when do you begin having this sort of a conversation with your parents?
Well, I think that just like financial planning, the sooner you start, the easier a difficult situation is, and the later you wait, the more you leave things to chance, and the greater the risk of something more catastrophic happening, either from a medical, financial, or familial relationship standpoint. So I would say early and often.
Okay. But it's hard, right?
It's definitely hard because there's this fear of the child that they're meddling in the parents' affairs. There's the fear of upsetting and or antagonizing an existing relationship with a sibling or siblings. But as you said, I've seen this in a number of different manners, personally and professionally, and the longer you wait, the worse it is. And the greater risk of something unanticipatedly bad and negative happening.
Yeah, and I want to definitely talk about how to protect yourself from something that's a little unexpected. What is step one? So I'm going to throw a couple of ideas out at you, and you tell me, do you want to lead with just asking a couple of questions, or do you want to lead like maybe with the big guns to show the seriousness and the severity of the need for this conversation by bringing in like a medical power of attorney or a power of attorney? Where does one even begin the conversation, Russell?
Well, I think you first have to begin with some basic understanding of, like you referenced, power of attorney. There's one for medical care, there's one for financial, and there's durable, which means it survives a incapacitating event or death even. And, these are important things for everyone to have, but particularly as I call it the fourth quarter, just to use a football analogy, the fourth quarter, the longer I've been in this business, and now as a 57-year-old man, you see I have a soon to be 84-year-old father. My mother passed away when she was 75. And so we're living this exact scenario as we speak today. But so are many of my peers. So I think, in my opinion, the first place to start is with yourself. And then if you have siblings, the siblings need to make sure they're on the same page, because if you have fractured messaging to the parent or parents, all that does is increase family stress for the children and for the parents. So I think the children have to be on the same page, which can be difficult, in today's world where people are spread out and not always on the same message, shall we say. But you got to get the kids on the same page, and then the kids in a safe, comfortable environment, and not from a demanding perspective, need to have an open yet direct conversation with the parent or parents.
Okay, well, it's interesting because you just kind of superseded where my brain went initially, talking about this, or my first line of question, which is, if you have siblings, right? Just because the sibling is the closest, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're the most qualified. How do you begin that conversation?
Well, that is challenging, and I think that women are better caregivers than men. Typically, if certainly nothing is absolute, but this has been my experience. And you do have to look at geography. You have to look at the finances of the children, and you have to look at how well do they get along. And then you have to see what you can develop from a common ground, common goal standpoint, and determine who's going to lead the process. And then you have to also make a decision, right? So you can't just stay in perpetuity in the conversation stage. You have to get to a point where you can act. So you have to determine in whatever the capacity of the children, how do you get to the decision point? And then when you make one, you're making that decision and going with it. And it's right or wrong. You're going to be doing the best that you can in a complicated situation. Then you have to live with it. So you can't play the blame game later. Well, you said to do this and I wanted to do something different. That's not how this should work. That's a recipe for disaster and family fracture. So, and someone's going to have to lead the process. If you just all go by default, then you're going to just not get your best result. That's, planning by circumstance, the helter-skelter plan or the state that you live in drawing your plan when you could have had a more positive impact on it and perhaps protected your parent from a financially fatal or medically fatal mistake.
What an interesting insight you just had there with taking the family members, the kids' financial situation into account also. Russell, I think this just once again shows, your organization's experience with, dealing with these sort of things. Now, so that let's just assume that things go well. So there's a person in the family, one of the children is voted, for lack of a better description, that they're going to be the decision maker, or they're going to be the kind of the stopping point or the bridge between the parents. Where do you go from there?
Well, once you've gotten common ground and agree what the message is and what is the outcome you're targeting, then you, as the siblings, need to coordinate the meeting with the parent or parents and sit down in an environment where they're going to be comfortable and have this conversation. It's still, you want to find out what are their goals in life and, what do they think the situation is. But then sometimes, rose-colored glasses, they're not going to want to admit that perhaps they should no longer be driving, that maybe they were taken advantage of by someone trying to sell them screens or buy something by phone, or, maybe they can never find their phone or their keys. They're just signs. Or they do things that endanger themselves. It just happens. So if they aren't willing to face that, then that's where the collective power of the family, surrounded in an environment of love and care, shares the hard message. Because I will tell you, it's a watershed event in a senior person's life when they lose their car keys, even if they can stay in their home and not have to move to independent or assisted living. It's a surrendering of independence. That is even multiplied if they end up having to leave their home for, even if it's independent living facility or assisted living. These are just watershed events in someone's life, and no one wants to get there or go there. But if they don't, they end up killing themselves or, God forbid, someone else. In some cases, I've seen it happen. So you basically share that message in the proper context and the proper environment. And then there's almost an inversion of the parent-child relationship where the child takes more of a parental role in the process.
You brought up the car keys thing, and their level of resistance, if that is sequential, right? So if a lot of times autonomy is judged by their ability to be autonomous, and driving in our country is a huge kind of sign of autonomy. And if they're not willing to give that up, then that's probably, maybe I should just ask this question, is that an indicator that there are going to be other issues in dealing with loss of control? Is that kind of a good kind of a test?
I would say so. Car keys is a big event. there are other things you can do, whether you bring in people to the home, where they have assistance with meals and things like that. But yeah, and I mean, ultimately, you have to decide how far are you willing to take this, because as I said, there's kind of an inversion of who's acting in the role of the responsible adult here. And you want to do the right thing, and that could mean getting them where they can't do it. That is where you'd get medical professionals involved. You referenced that earlier, but that's not typically what has to happen. You can cajole and convince through typical family conversation if you have the right intent. I mean, I think that to me, as you set the ground rules, and that it's in love of family and wanting to protect themselves, and you protect them and other people. It's not just about them. I think that's a critical factor. It's about what they might do to themselves or somebody else. So you have to have that understanding, because you have to be on the same page to get somewhere. But yeah, keys, and if they're willing to either, I mean, it's not always take the keys. It could be, look, I agree that I will not drive at night. I agree I will not drive on the interstate, drive out of town. You can agree on the parameters of fencing, shall you will, putting some parameters around it instead of just the absolute removal of the keys.
Sure.
And frankly, a lot of these people can go to more of a community-based independent living scenario and still keep their keys. You just have to, it's a fact pattern circumstance, just like financial planning.
Well, let's talk about that as a part of the financial plan or the planning process. And I'm glad that you're talking about increments, because it seems to me that there are a lot of people who really look at those things as black and white, and it's not black and white. There's so many different incremental steps that you can take. Now, in the financial planning process, whether you're dealing with mom and dad or the sandwich generation, when do you bring up things like the durable power of attorney, the financial power of attorney? Because I know that is a conversation that you have during the process, especially with the kids who are sandwiched in between. As a planner, could you give our listeners just a little bit of an insight on when that conversation happens, or how do you help the client discover that those sorts of things are needed?
Yeah, that's something that we do as part and parcel of the basic financial planning process. So I think it's a bit more difficult. There's a fear factor if you, as the child, are supposed to ask your parent if they've done these things. But, it's important that you do so. But again, I think you have to communicate among the siblings first, because that's a slippery slope. It can be perceived, whereas you're trying to kind of dig your way into a favored capacity. But, there's so many things you can prevent or avoid if you have these proper documents, and they're state specific. So we bring it up as a matter of routine, and then we try and look one generation up and two down. So it depends on where in the circle of life you are, if there's anybody in your family behind you still, or if you're the oldest generation, or if there's two below you, or one or none. So it just kind of depends on the life cycle. But these are documents that need to be done whether you have children or not, unless you want the state that you live in to decide what's going to happen, and other people to do these things. And they will not do it as well. They will not do it like your family would have wanted, and they will not do it in a cost-efficient manner. So it's a matter of, do you want to cede control, or do you want to take control and handle something that's not always easy to talk about? And most people don't want to talk about potentially thorny subjects, you understand? So, I think, though, you have to get to the point where, again, you have the siblings on the same page, and then they ask their parents if they have these things, and that there's an understanding you're not doing this from financially motivated reasons. You're just trying to make sure that bad things don't happen. And, you can get a child or children on a bank account. You can do paired titling, things like that. And you can do this power of attorney as well. But you got to be careful about that. You don't want to have undue influence, or have someone taking money from the parent, using it for themselves because they're there. And I mean, we've seen a lot of different things like that happen through the years too. But
Well, I know you're not an attorney, so I'm not trying to put you in a an attorney or providing legal advice situation. But do you have like a network of attorneys? So that you've identified this in going one up generation and two down generations in the financial planning process. How do you recommend? Okay, so look, as per what I just heard you say, Mr. and Mrs. Client, it looks like your mom is probably, you should probably have the discussion, number one, and two, if not, get that durable power of attorney in place. What is your client's next
Well,
steps
that's
there?
when they're going to have to, they have to know what they want and who they want to serve as their, uh, the guardian role and or the backup to them. If something happens and they become incapacitated, then you're typically going to have three names, a first, second, and third position. And you want to be thoughtful in who you're selecting for that. A lot of people will choose a parent, and that's great unless your parent's 75 years old. And that's where you have to have the conversation about corporate trustees, because they stand the test of time and all they do is strictly interpret the document. But I think first and foremost, what we encourage our clients to do if they're older is make sure their documents are current. And then it's better if you think about it in terms of communication flow, if the parents, i.e. the older generation, actually communicate to their children what they want. And one of the things we do with our planning software that comes with a digital vault, you can actually put recorded messaging in there or video where the person, the parent in this case, as I'm speaking about it, a grandparent, they can actually video record what their wishes are or, at least audible recordings and then post that in this vault. So if something happens, they're not just trying to interpret documents. They have the messaging from the person whose documents they're looking at to go with it. So if you imagine the water flowing downhill, the communication flowing downhill, if it starts parent to child instead of child back to parent, it's a lot better because children only do that because they feel a perceived need to take control of the situation. And the parent has kind of abdicated the control because they're not responsibly handling the matter. Does that make sense?
It does make a lot of sense. So how do you deal with the emotional issues that come with your clients having to make these difficult decisions? We'll kind of wrap up there. And then I always want to ask you the same question I think I ask you every time, Russell, which is, what didn't I ask you? So first off, let's talk about some of the emotional components and how you can help deal with that with your experience. And then if there's anything I missed that I should have asked you about this conversation, let's go ahead and go there.
All right. Well, I would say that you have to get it out there. What we would encourage our clients to do who are the parents when they're older is to communicate this to the children, and then you have to review it and update it on a regular basis. So how we would handle that is it is emotional. So that's where we kind of change hats, if you will, more from a financial planning perspective to a counseling perspective. And once you put it out there, sometimes you just have to be quiet and, let that information settle. And then we also have some questions. We have a document we created called Dreams, Visions, Goals. And it makes the person, as they're going through the planning process, kind of think through these issues. There are no yes, no questions on there. And there are questions about legacy and family and their definition of success and things like this. So you have to draw them out, and then they have to actually thoughtfully pursue in their own mind what they want the outcome to be and whether they want to, in some manner, direct the outcome, because none of us control the outcome. We just think we do. That's a myth, but we can manage. And so that's what we would encourage most importantly, is them to deal with it. And then, massage and handle the thorny issues, whether it be sibling rivalry or children who have substance abuse or spending issues or entitlement issues or things like that. You just have to deal with whatever the fact pattern is. And that's not always easy. And make sure it gets done, because if it doesn't get done, again, you're defaulting to the state that you live in and the letting the chips fall where they may. And if you think you have issues with your children and dealing with this type matter, imagine what it's like if it happens without planning it's just, the chips fall where they may. You're putting your children in the least advantageous position to be a successful family going forward, if that makes sense.
It does. So what should I have asked you that I didn't ask you about this whole dealing with finances and how to have the conversation and the different steps that you need to set up in order to take care of your parents when they can't take care of themselves?
Perhaps, is it wrong to ask them? And, or are you stepping out of bounds? And I'd say it's all in your approach and your intent. I think if the parent is not dealing with this issue, then the children need to do so. And it's got to be with good intent, out of love and respect for your parent, not because you're trying to feather your own nest or further your own financial gain, which there are a lot of people out there who are devious in that manner. But I think you have to bring it up if you're put in that position. And I think, if your siblings then won't participate, you approach them and they won't, then it's incumbent upon you to do what you should, because someone's got to lead, and then perhaps they'll fall in line, but then perhaps they won't. What are you going to do? You can't be frozen because they won't do anything, but you should try and work with your family first. If that, it's not an easy order necessarily, but a lot of people, children, they're just very uncomfortable bringing this up with their parents. We don't like to talk about money in this country. And it really does. That lack of communication causes bad outcomes. And you see all the time, I think I've said this in a prior podcast, a lot of times the parent generation will spend a tremendous amount of time and money preparing the money for the family, but they don't prepare the family for the money. And without preparing the family for the money, it doesn't matter what great documents you have, the best attorney in the world, and all the things you do, you're going to end up with a bad outcome 1 to 2 generations down the road. That's where the saying shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations comes from.
Well, Russell, thank you so much for your insight in a difficult conversation. And I think, once again, this really does show that if you're not working with a company that has a substantial amount of experience in the planning process to have these conversations, then you probably should reconsider who you're working with. So, Russell, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it, and we'll speak to you next time.
Yep. If you have not subscribed to the podcast, make sure you click that subscribe now button below. That way, every time they come out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. And I am sure you know somebody who needs to hear this podcast. So if you have friends and family, your parents, your kids, your siblings who should listen to this 20-some-odd minute podcast, because it's going to impact you if you want it to or not, because it's just the reality of the situation. All you have to do is click that share button. Super, super easy to forward this on to your friends and family. So for everybody at Jacobs, Coolidge & Company, this is Matt Halloran, and we'll see you on the other side of the mic very soon.
The content is developed from sources believed to be providing accurate information. The information in this material is not intended as tax or legal advice. Please consult legal or tax professionals for specific information regarding your individual situation. The opinions expressed and material provided are for general information and should not be considered a solicitation for the purchase or sale of any security. Russell C. Jacobs III, Carl B. Coolidge, James Jacobs, and William Schwartz are registered representatives of and offer securities, investment advisory, and financial planning services through MML Investor Services, LLC, member SIPC, Supervisory Office, Jacksonville, Florida. Jacobs, Coolidge & Company, LLC is not a subsidiary or affiliate of MML Investor Services, LLC, or its affiliated companies.